the racial doctrine and policies developed throughout Mormon history, kind of what the influences inside and outside, what those battles and conflicts were like.
Mormonism is born in an era where racial ideas, especially connected to religion, are in flux. A growing slave empire within America, and with that, a growing pro-slavery theology that you see in certain segments in the nation that I think are going to end up influencing Mormonism, at the same time that you have a growing abolitionist theology coming out of the North. Mormonism's answers are never fully consistent, nor are they fully coherent in the form of being, systematic. We have in the Book of Mormon the statements that all are alike under God, black, white, male or female. But then you have Joseph Smith when he ends up producing a book of scripture called the Book of Abraham that speaks of a racial curse, although I should note that you don't have many Mormons connecting those passages in the Book of Abraham to those of African lineage until decades later, but at least the seeds of that is there. You have several early Black converts to the faith, both men and women. Some Black men who hold the priesthood, like Elijah Abel, who is ordained by Joseph Smith to a 70 in Kirtland. Several other Black members like Jane Manning James, who are full members of the community in Nauvoo. And then you start seeing a bit of a hardening. Now, I should say there's not some Edenic, great, racially inclusive period of the church in Kirtland and Nauvoo. Just as Joseph Smith was allowing Elijah Abel to both be ordained to the priesthood and exercise the priesthood, he's also signing city ordinances in Nauvoo that outlawed interracial marriage. So, right, I need to make clear that there's no racial universalist or early Mormonism that, they lost. But there were some policies that were scaled back. And I think a lot of those policies get scaled back in the late 1840s. Brigham Young discovers through several Black members of the faith that one of the greatest fears of Northern white men was coming true in Mormonism, which is if you allow an interracial congregation, that's going to result in interracial sex, because you have several Black members of the faith who end up marrying white women, and that's where you draw the line. And so you see William McCary in Winter Quarters, later Walker Lewis's son, Enoch Lovejoy Lewis, out in Massachusetts. They both get caught with white women, and Brigham Young declares that interracial relationships are appalling. We need to do all we can to stop it. And that's what results in the early 1850s with him declaring that there is a curse placed on those who are descended of Ham, and that they shall never hold the priesthood. And it's at that same time that Brigham Young declares Utah to be a slave state. But even then, after Brigham Young makes this declaration that there's a racial restriction, it's never fully systematized for decades. It is not until 1908 that leaders of the church declare we need to have a standardized racial restriction here. And they use the same type of ideology that was then sweeping the nation. That was called the one drop rule. If you had one drop of African ancestry in your blood, that means you are of a different race and you should not have equality. This is at the same time that W.E. Du Bois, one of the great historians, critics, and thinkers of early 20th century, said that the 20th century will be delineated on the color line. Mormons drew their own color line in 1908. Why in 1908? Many of the early Black pioneers had died by then. They had been the living memories of a time where they previously had Joseph Smith being sealed to a Black servant. That was Jane Manning James. She claimed that Joseph Smith had offered a sealing to her in Nauvoo. And so she's saying, how do you square that with the fact that now you're not allowing me in the 1890s to enter the temple? Because by then they had a policy that those with African lineage could not enter the temple. And Joseph F. Smith and others were like, well, Joseph Smith wouldn't have offered some kind of sealing. We need to come up with something else. So in 1894, they offered to seal Jane Manning James to Joseph Smith in proxy as a servant for eternity. And yet Jane Manning James wasn't even allowed in the temple to participate in that. Someone acted as proxy for her, as Joseph F. Smith acted as proxy for Joseph Smith. And that's where that sealing happened. And then that policy that was initiated in 1908, that was formalized, remains in place for 70 years until 1978, when the church ended that racial restriction that both barred Black men from the priesthood and Black women from temple rights and full membership. We could talk about the whole lead up of what led to that overturning, because that's a fascinating story.
Got to read the book for that.
Right. But even after, I should emphasize, even after 1978, there were lingering racial problems. And I actually detail in the book how there were many Black members of the faith who are like, hey, it's great that that restriction is gone, but some of the theologies that undergird that restriction are still in place. And until we confront that, we're going to continue to have major problems. And it's not until 2012 when a BYU professor spoke out loud these theological doctrines that had mostly been kept silent, that the church is like, oh man, now we need to actually directly renounce this. And that's when we get some of the most direct statements by the church renouncing their past doctrines.